Uh, it is my pleasure to, greet you here this afternoon, colleagues, and for those of you who are from outside of Cleveland, welcome to Cleveland. We're always delighted to have guests and visitors come to our beautiful city, a city that really begins to understand the necessity of inclusion, diversity, equity, and all of those things which make for a vibrant city. There's some great work underway here. There's more fields to be plowed, but there's great work here, and I am so happy to be a part of a cadre of counterparts that recognize that work and are leading that work and advancing it in our community. With that said, it is a signal honor to introduce Dr. Eddie S. Claude Jr. I couldn't believe my great fortune when Deborah asked me to take this particular session, as I am a devoted fan and follower of this incredible individual. Dr. Claude is a William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. He is chair of the Department of African American Studies and the current president of the American Academy of Religion. He has written for the likes of the New York Times and the Huffington Post. He is a Morehouse man. Now, they say you can tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much. I am the mother of a Morehouse man, so I know firsthand. But I was thrilled to learn of his connection with that phenomenal place. He holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University and a PhD in religion from Princeton. In 2015, he was awarded the honorary doctorate from Colgate University, where he delivered an incredible commencement address entitled "Turning Our Backs." He's a columnist for Time magazine, and he's regularly provides commentary on radio and television news programs like Democracy Now!, The 11th Hour, and my favorite, Morning Joe. His most well-known books, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America. Both books take a wide look at Black communities and reveal complexities, vulnerabilities, and opportunities for hope. But to put it in the words of one of his most favorite quotes from W.B. Du Bois, not hopeless, but a bit unhopeful. Powerful. Bill Moyer says, "Democracy in Black is rich in history and bold in opinion, and inconvenient truths leap from every page." Inconvenient truths leap from every page. Now, we don't want you leaping out of your seats after this session, but I do ask you to sit back and listen to the words of this powerful American, truly American voice. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Eddie Claude Jr.
How y'all doing? Good. Thank you, Ms. Copeland, for that generous introduction. I'm a country boy, and it's always a blessing to meet someone with such a gorgeous and beautiful spirit, such a welcoming spirit, and to tell you that you're doing all right. So thank you for that generous introduction and for being here today, and all your support for what's going on, what's happening in the state of Ohio. I want to thank Deborah for being bold enough to ask me to come here and enduring my schedule. Thank you for working with Dion to make this happen. I'm horrible with email, and so I'm glad I'm here. I want to thank the board. I want to thank all of you. Trey, I want to congratulate you for your honor today. I don't have much time with you, so I want to jump into this. Is this all right? Is that all right? In his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued, among other things, that white supremacy stood in the way of democracy in this country, that it was an ever-present force in America, frustrating the dreams of the nation's darker citizens and undermining any pretense to racial justice. He wrote, quote, "Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talk of it as an objective. But most whites in America," King writes, "proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement." That equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized, he wrote. They're not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects to retain it, end quote. That's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, King did not draw this conclusion from some abstract set of ideological principles. Instead, his was a conclusion drawn from the intense experience of challenging racial segregation in the South and of confronting a nation that, no matter its stated commitments to democracy, supported the underlying beliefs which sustained that form of life. Dr. King came to understand, and this is often obscured in our yearly celebration of him, the depths of American racism. He had underestimated how deeply rooted white supremacy was in the habits of American life, how the transformation of the heart he had so eloquently preached about since the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott required a fundamental change in the practices and structures of the country, change that could not depend solely on the moral conscience of white people, no matter black people's willingness to sacrifice and suffer because of their investment in whiteness. In fact, in August of 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated plainly, quote, "The vast majority of white Americans are racist, either consciously or unconsciously," end quote. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you the truth. So you're just going to have to sit there and bear with me. This commitment to the idea that white people were superior to others distorted the principles of democracy and disfigured the moral character of those who believed it. King had seen it up close in the contorted faces of sheriffs in small southern towns and in the ferocity of young white toughs in Cicero, Illinois. He remained committed throughout to the moral power of his call to the nation. He never stopped being a preacher after all, but he now understood that something far greater was required if America was to be redeemed. Now, I've spent a lot of time over the course of my career thinking about this passage from Where Do We Go From Here? In some ways, King's formulation hinges on a devastating judgment about our national commitment to racial justice. He claimed that the country viewed the idea of racial equality as a loose expression of improvement. Now, when thought of in this way, racial justice gets reduced to a charitable enterprise. A charitable enterprise, a philanthropic practice by which white people do good for black people. For him and for me, this is not equality. In fact, such an approach reflects the underlying problematic that haunts the nation in matters of race. Just think about it. Here we are in 2017, and we're confronting a wide range of protests against police brutality, against black and brown people in this country. And someone like Colin Kaepernick, in support of those who demand equal treatment under the law, decided to take a knee, and he's now, of course, he's unemployed. Now, know how we think about this. Before the horrors of Las Vegas and the devastation of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, President Trump at a campaign rally in Alabama took issue with the protest and with passion urged the NFL owners to fire the SOBs. You remember that? Bracketing where you might stand on the question of the protest during the national anthem, whether you agree with it or not. What was fascinating and horrifying all at once was the response among some of Trump's supporters. Joe Walsh, the former representative, the former congressman, declared that rich black football players are ungrateful, end quote. Ungrateful. And this sentiment was echoed across social media platforms. Now, the idea of great gratitude is striking here, yes? It reveals that for some, the success of black NFL players had little to do with their talent and dedication to their profession, that they haven't worked tirelessly to reach the highest level of their sport. Instead, they should be grateful for the opportunity to play. This idea of gratefulness extends to black students on college campuses. The late Justice Scalia said this about black students on Ivy League campuses, right? You should shut up and just be thankful you're there. Protesting, those students at Princeton who were protesting the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy. This idea of gratitude evidences itself in the workspaces that black people occupy. I hear it all the time here at Princeton. I should be grateful that I'm at Princeton. After all, I am an affirmative action baby, right? Just to give you a sense of how odd this formulation is, imagine someone saying to a hedge fund manager on Wall Street, you should be grateful that you are allowed to make all of that money. It's a formulation reserved for certain kinds of folks. Now, this example illustrates the truth of Dr. King's insight in 1967 that it still obtains some 50 years later. For many white Americans, the idea of racial equality is understood as a form of charity, something to be given away as if you actually possess it to give it away. Now, what this philanthropic approach reveals, at least to me, is something more fundamental. Remember, Dr. King referred to a gap that white people are not psychologically organized to close. Now, I want to suggest that here Dr. King refers to the fundamental problem at the heart of our national malaise, what I want to call the value gap. Y'all all right? I just want to check on you now. You should see your faces the way you're looking at it. Some of you like this. Pay all this money to come up in here and hear this, right? But no, it's okay. Now, the phrase white supremacy conjures images of bad men in hooded robes who believe in white power, burning crosses and screaming the word nigger. But that's too easy. On a broader level, white supremacy involves the way a society organizes itself and what and whom it chooses to value. Apartheid South Africa, the Jim Crow South, Nazi Germany are clear examples of societies organized by white supremacy. In each case, the belief that white people are valued more than non-white people shaped every aspect of social and political life. It determined where you lived, what schools you attended, and what jobs were available to you. It reminded you daily of your status and station in life, and that's white supremacy without all the bluster. That's all that it is. A set of practices informed by the fundamental belief that white people are valued more than others. Now, America isn't exactly like the extreme example of apartheid South Africa, but we do live in a country where every day black people confront the damning reality that we are less valued. From unemployment rates to rates of incarceration to mortality rates to childhood poverty, we can see the value gap. We talk about the achievement gap in education or the wealth gap between white Americans and other groups, but the value gap reflects something more basic, that no matter our stated principles or how much progress we think we've made, white people are valued more than others in this country. And that fact continues to shape the life chances of millions of our fellow Americans. Now think about this. Think about it. At every crucial moment in our nation's history, when there have been fundamental changes in how we've dealt with the problem of race, the value gap has been reasserted and has limited the scope of change. The powerful ideals of the American Revolution, which challenged the authority of monarchs and insisted on the principles of freedom and equality in the context of democratic institutions, those principles were reconciled with the institution of racial slavery. People could talk of freedom and liberty and hold black slaves. from the first Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1790, which only allowed white persons to attain citizenship. And that racial understanding of citizenship persisted until 1954 and undergirds the current debates around immigration in this country. The brutal war to end slavery and the efforts during Reconstruction to imagine a genuine multiracial democracy also were tossed aside. Jim Crow took over the South. White supremacy shaped our foreign policy in places like the Philippines and Cuba, and convict leasing emerged as another form of slavery, the value gap, reasserting itself at every moment of advance. Cries for law and order and cries over law and order and cries over reverse racism echoed throughout the nation as black folk marched in the streets, organized in their communities, and forced the government to end Jim Crow and to embrace, at least in principle, the idea of full equality during the mid-20th century. And here we are today. The historical election of Barack Obama occasioned the vitriol of the Tea Party, occasioned urgent efforts to change voting laws in ways that threaten black voters throughout the country. And if Ta-Nehisi Coates is right, we ended up with the likes of Donald Trump in the White House. At each moment, a moment of advance, we see a reassertion of the belief that white people matter more. Each of these moments of racial progress represent a profound change in the country. America has and is truly different because these events happened, but the extent of the change was always limited by the value gap, a belief that white people mattered more, a belief that adjusted and adapted to new conditions. With each step forward, equally powerful forces pulled the nation back in the direction of the status quo. Right? So we believe that racial equality is a charitable enterprise, that is a philanthropic enterprise, that it is something that some folks can give to others because they possess it. And that happens in the context of a society that has been organized on the belief that some people matter more than others. And that belief is not just simply the possession of loud racists. That's too easy. It's too easy to condemn the white nationalists and neo-Nazis in Charlottesville without understanding how our daily choices and actions, the habits that guide us, give them life. Right? The value gap is not about loud races. It cuts much deeper. All Americans are shaped by biases, stereotypes, and the history of racism in this country that incline us to treat certain people in certain ways. We are shaped by what I want to call racial habits. Habits. And those habits shape not only our lives and personal choices, but the policies we create that reinforce the value gap. It even shapes your philanthropic efforts. Racial habits are the ways we live the belief that white people are valued more than others. They are the things we do without thinking that sustain the value gap. They range from snap judgments we make about black people that rely on stereotypes to the ways we think about race that we get from living within our own respective communities. Both show how we account for the persistence of racial equality today. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Right? I'm telling you that the value gap is sustained by racial habits. Right? And those habits aren't the possession of loud racists. Cameron, you okay? I know I told y'all I wasn't going to move, and I'm moving now. I'm a professor. How are we doing on time? We all right? Right? So one of the ways in which we have to understand this, I grew up in a small town on the coast of Mississippi, a town called Moss Point, named after the moss on the magnolia trees. And my dad was a postman, so I lived a middle-class life, in effect. You remember, you delivered mail. That was hot cotton back in the day. But my mother cleaned toilets for a living. And my dad knew he had precocious children. My sister graduated valedictorian of our high school, right? I'm doing all kinds of things. I left actually high school at the age of 15 to go to Morehouse, right? He knew he had precocious kids, so he decided to move us from one side of town to the other. And I remember when we were moving into the house, I was playing with my Tonka truck, right? Making the Tonka truck noise. You remember those old Tonka trucks? Right? And then all of a sudden I heard, "Stop playing with that nigga." It was the first time I had been called that word in that context. Right? I grabbed my truck, I looked at my new friend squarely in the face, and I ran into the house, and I told my dad what happened. And my dad is a Vietnam vet who doesn't suffer white people easily. Grabbed his .38 and he ran outside. Now, usually we tell the story of American racism like that, right? We tell the story of some kid being wounded by some mean-spirited adult who called him the N-word, and then that kid has to spend the rest of his or her life proving that she's not that. But I had already learned the value gap by the very move. We moved from the east side of Moss Point to the west side of Moss Point. On the east side, the sidewalks weren't paved. The piping wasn't very good, so when it rained, it flooded. The baseball diamond wasn't cut. The houses were smaller. The schools weren't as good. When we moved to the west side of town, right? Spatially, I was learning race. Getting called the N-word was just the icing on the cake. Right? So we tend to think about that parent who called the child the N-word as the bad person. But race was already learned spatially. That's all you got to do is drive around Cleveland and you learn. Yeah. So y'all don't know that. Right? Drive down neighborhoods. It's built. The built environment reflects race. The differences between the two sides of town silently but powerfully communicated the racial order of things and the expectations I should have about my own life. I just recently bumped into one of my friends who grew up with me down the street in our little neighborhood. Can you imagine in my little neighborhood, we had the speechwriter for Condoleezza Rice, myself, endowed professor at Harvard, at Berkeley Law, another professor, in this little small town in Moss Point of less than 15,000 people. Something must be in the Mississippi water. But she was telling me the story of when we were all getting ready to go to Boys State. And we were all there, and I was next to my friend Murray, and his mother leaned over to my friend's mother and said, "See, that's the problem. He doesn't understand his place." He doesn't understand his place. We learn race in the places we live, not as rules, but as habits, as a kind of general know-how that enables us to get about. We learn that there are places they live and places we shouldn't go. Getting called the N-word, painful as it is or as it was for me, was again just the icing on the cake. Racial habits are formed by the outcomes we see in the world rather than by the complex processes that produce those outcomes. We see black and white sides of town and internalize certain assumptions about what that separation means. Rarely are those assumptions informed by the history of deliberate policies that created a dual housing market and residential segregation. We simply live where we live. We see double-digit black unemployment and infer things about black people from this statistic, but we rarely invoke the history of unfair labor practices, the exclusion of black people from labor unions, or the dual labor market that tracks certain folks to certain sectors. We rarely talk about unfair labor practices or, as I said, the exclusion of black people from labor unions or the dual labor market, responding based on habits formed within context. It's no surprise that so many white Americans today believe that black people are lazy, that we don't want to work, that we're looking for a government handout. Trump even invoked this in his response to the mayor of San Juan. Right? Yeah. But the beautiful thing about habits is that they're not fixed forever. This is different from unconscious bias. See, unconscious bias allows you to say, well, yeah, I didn't know I had it, which means you don't have to take responsibility for it. Habits are different. You can have the habit of smoking, but you have to take responsibility for that habit, yes? This is why I use the language of habits instead of unconscious bias. Habits are not fixed forever. If we are aware of their presence in our lives, we can change them. But we can't just look inside ourselves and solve the problem. If habits are formed in our social world, then focusing on what's happening inside our heads won't do the job. And this is where you come in. Only by changing the world we live in will we change the choices it prompts us to make. If we want to change our racial habits, we have to transform bad schools where the majority of black children learn. Stop housing a disproportionate number of black people in prisons, jails, or halfway houses, and remake the places where we live that keep us ignorant of each other. Mm-hmm. We can't do it all at once, but our efforts might lead us to examine the practices and beliefs that give the value gap life. I'm coming home. Wendell Berry, the Kentucky-born writer, whom I love, makes this point in his powerful book, The Hidden Wound. Quote, "I'm trying to establish the outlines of an understanding of myself in regard to what was fated to be the continuing crisis in my life, the crisis of racial awareness, the sense of being doomed by my history to be, if not always, a racist, then a man always limited by the inheritance of racism, condemned to always be of the necessity not only to be a racist, to be always dealing deliberately with the reflex of racism that are embedded in my mind as deeply, at least, as the language I speak. In short, we're all shaped by racial habits in some way or another. I am, just as you are. They are as natural to America as apple pie and fireworks on the 4th of July, and come to us as easily as the words we've learned since we were at our mother's knee. So in this sense, racial habits are our inheritance. They contain the history of white supremacy that has shaped and continues to shape this country. There are the millions of accumulated decisions that make racial inequality an inextricable part of what it means to be an American. We're going to have to do more than just say, can we all get along, to uproot them. If we are to undo these habits, at least some of them, something dramatic must happen, just as Dr. King understood. In 1967, he had come to understand that we needed to do something more dramatic. It would involve a revolution of value. And this, as we address the structural realities of the value gap, entails finally putting to bed the idea of white people as valued more than others. It involves changing our view of government by changing our demand of government. It involves changing what ultimately matters to us, rejecting once and for all a society content with the idea that there are disposable people, To do this, we must be, to echo Barry's words, in a continual crisis of racial awareness. We have to understand, without a hint of sentimentality, what some have to deal with every single day. What some people have to deal with every single day. As James Baldwin put it in his essay, The Uses of the Blues, quote, I'm talking about what happens to you if, having barely escaped suicide or death or madness or yourself, you watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you are powerless. You are really powerless against the forces of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive. And no amount of liberal jargon and no amount of talk about how well and how far we have progressed does anything to soften or to point out any solution to this dilemma. In every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, Baldwin writes, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make that child who will be despised not despise himself. I don't know what the Negro problem means to white people, but this is what it means to Negroes. Here I am, the president of the American Academy of Religion, the largest body of scholars of religion in the world. When I got the call from the organization that I'd been elected the president, I was excited. I'm a country boy from Mississippi. I wanted to call my mama immediately, but my son called me. Not too long afterwards. Some of you have heard me tell this story, but my son called me, and I could hear in his voice that something was wrong. And I said, what's going on? And he said, Dad, I was doing an assignment. My son attends Brown, by the way. We've done everything right. I was doing an assignment for my urban ethnography class, and I was in a park in a high-scale neighborhood. And as I was sitting there just taking my notes, the police cruiser pulled by. And he drove by slowly, and then suddenly he hit a U-turn, and then he drove up on the sidewalk, and his lights came on. And he came up to me, and he said, who are you and why are you here? And my son said, yes, sir, I'm a Brown student, and I'm doing an assignment for my class. And he says, well, the park closes at 9:30. And my son says, yes, sir, but it's only 7:30. And at that point, when he said, yes, sir, it's only 7:30, the officer's partner came around with his hand on his weapon. And then they both leaned into him and said, the park closes at 9:30. And my son put his hands in his air, tapped his girlfriend, and said, officers, we don't want any trouble. We're leaving now. Now, at that moment, I had just received a phone call, that I was the president of the largest body of scholars in the world. And then my baby, my only child, called me to tell me that the police had stopped him because his body, that black body, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if he had not responded appropriately, I could have lost my baby. For what? Why? have to worry about that when your child leaves the house. Will they come back? You don't have to worry about what happens when they're stopped. My son, just another story, just happened this summer. He was interning at the Capitol in Trenton, New Jersey for a lobbying organization, a progressive organization, and he was driving to meet his boss so that they could lobby this bill that, of course, Christie undermined. Right, but you get the point. And as he was driving, he went to park, and the police officer stopped him, and he said, "Who are you and where are you going?" He said, "I'm just parking here. You were just going to drive by me?" "No, you can't park here. Go down here." Then he was stopped again by a police officer. Said, "Who are you and why are you here?" He said, "Officer, what are you doing? Where are you going?" "Officer, I'm just trying to park. I work here." Then he was stopped again for the third time. And then the officer said, "Who's your PO, officer? Who's your PO?" He's dressed in a suit. And he came home and he was on the verge of tears. Grown man, 21 years old, on the verge of tears. He's so angry. And here I am trying to figure out, I'm running around the country every single day, talking about race, talking about the value gap, talking about racial habits. And here's my baby right in front of me, dealing with what Jimmy Baldwin was talking about. I've left the notes, can you tell? And I didn't know what to say. The only thing I did was pull out a bottle of 12-year single malt scotch. I said, "Come here." And I poured it. And I said, "This is what we have to deal with. Why do we live in a society? Why do we live in a society where some people are valued more than others? Where some people have to worry about their babies?" Baldwin, in this moment, foregrounds the value gap and its distorting effects. That the fact of growing up, of coming of age in a society that denies you standing, distorts one's sense of self and disfigures one's character. And I'm not just talking about black people. You know, Lincoln, I think America's greatest president, said this is a country of the democracies, of the people, for the people, by the people. But Lincoln couldn't be the kind of man his conception of democracy required, because he believed black people were inferior and that white people were superior. And that belief distorted his character. It blocked the way to him becoming the kind of democratic agent that would make democracy a reality. What are we going to do? How are we going to address this malaise? When are we going to get off the racial hamster wheel that has defined this country for so long? When are you going to stop believing that equality is something that you can give someone? When are we going to understand justice to be a fundamental and constitutive part of who we take ourselves to be? America is not the possession of white people. America is a broad and expansive idea that confirms and affirms the capacity of everyday, ordinary people. How will we stand true to the true meaning of what it means to be a part of this fragile experiment in democracy? Walt Whitman said, "I hear the word democracy used a lot, but seldom do I understand and hear its meaning." We stand at the precipice. We're in a moment of crisis. The glare of our national innocence has dimmed. 59 people, 58 people dead. People mourning all over the country. We have to confront the ugliness of who we are. I'll end with this quotation. I just skipped like 7 pages. If we're going to achieve our country, we have to break the back of this ongoing disbelief that somehow the value gap doesn't define our country. We have to shatter the myth that protects our national innocence. Our challenge is, can we imagine the country otherwise? Are we willing to imagine America as truly a multiracial democracy, or are we willing to toss the entire fragile experiment in the trash bin because we refuse to give up the idea that white people are valued more than others? We've got to confront this without sentimentality, We have to be in a continual crisis of racial awareness as you do your work. We have to understand without a hint of sentimentality what some have to deal with every single day. We have to understand that we have to confront the ugliness of our history. And as James Baldwin wrote in The White Man's Guilt, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely or even something or principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, Baldwin writes, since it is to history that we owe our frame of references, our identities, our aspirations, and it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because thereafter one enters into battle with that historical creation oneself. We have to confront unflinchingly how we got to now. Everything rests on how we take up that task. Thank you very much.
I can't do it, I gotta cry.
See, I'm a Morehouse man. You got to worry because I run my mouth for an hour. It's the preacher in me.
As I looked out, Dr. Gard, as you spoke, I would see head movement. I saw a few nods, but I saw a lot of shaking. Mm-hmm. I would dare say if you nodded, which I did, I lived that truth. Mm-hmm. That you beautifully illustrated. I'm the mother of 2 black sons. And if you shook your head, I say good for you because you live in privilege, because you don't have to have the same burden that Dr. Gard and I have about our sons and our children and our friends' children and our families. Powerful as this is, the work that the individuals in this room do in philanthropy is extraordinarily important to the communities where they operate. What would be your best advice to them as they begin to process your message and begin to carry back to their work how they can incorporate or think through some of this?
You know, one of the things that we always have to be mindful of and concerned about when we do this kind of public intellectual work, I can't see people over there. Y'all all right? Y'all see us? Can we move this down?
Yeah.
I guess not. See, you see how people just cause trouble? I'm sorry. Let me move back. Move the chairs forward. Okay, good. How about this? I'm a Democrat, small d, at heart. One of the things, the biggest concerns that I have is that in these moments where you try to clear space, you then fill it with your voice as if you have the answers. I don't have the answers, right? All of the answers. But one of the things that I do know is that we have to change the frame, right? So I don't know how you do it, but I know that we have to change how we approach whatever we're going to do. And I think the basic assumption that I have with regards to organizations that are committed to the idea of racial justice or racial equality is the basic frame has to be, how do I put myself out of business? How do I figure out, right, that I'm no longer needed? What do I need to do, right? And so you have certain industries or certain philanthropic organizations, particularly say around schools, that their existence is almost contingent upon the inequity built into the school system. And I think the strategy has to be, or the approach has to be, right? How do I figure out, through my business plan, through whatever I'm laying out, that to make myself irrelevant? And at that point, then the move then we're in a different position. We're orienting ourselves to the problem differently, right? Because we're not invested in the problem, right? In that way, we're invested in solutions, impact investments. I learned that phrase from you, right? We're invested in concrete solutions that ultimately, if we're successful, right, would mean that we don't have to be anymore. Does that make sense? And beyond that, I'm open to hearing more than suggesting, right? But it seems to me that we have to change the frame. And part of changing that frame is to understand that what you're doing is not charity. It's not charity. It's justice work, right? And justice work for me isn't tied to identity politics. I have this debate with Joe all the time. Right? He said, all this identity politics. I said, the fact that women should have equal pay is identity politics? Why isn't that justice? Why isn't that a justice claim? Why is that an identity politics claim? The fact that black people should be treated equally under the law, and we should organize around the fact that some people aren't being treated equally under the law, why is that identity politics? Why isn't that a justice claim, right? So identity politics for me is a kind of, red herring. Part of what I'm interested in is the question of justice, right? Of justice, not just simply justice and fairness, but justice, a just set of arrangements where everyday ordinary people can not only dream dreams, but to make those dreams a reality, right? So that's my long-winded way of saying it. So.
You said it quite well. Okay, well, we've been given the sign to wrap.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I thought we were 2:30? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. My bad. I told you I could run my mouth.
Yeah. We were discussing prior to the opportunity for the audience to engage with Dr. God, but unfortunately we don't have the time for that. But I want to congratulate Philanthropy Ohio. I want to thank the board, and I want to especially thank Deb for organizing and arranging for you to be here, Dr. God. This is brought... This takes a great deal of bravery on your part. And I thank you, my sister, for stepping out and doing that. I hope you have a job and you get back to work. I want to tell you how honored I am to be a part of this session. And I know that I speak for my CEO and the leadership of my company, how proud the Key Bank is to be the sponsor of this particular session, where we attempt, not always do, but we attempt to walk the talk. I would say that at this juncture, probably there are many of you who have a lot of things swirling around in your hearts and your spirit, in your heads and what have you. And what we'd like you to do is engage in honest conversations at this point. We want you to have a conversation at your table, and there are some places where you can take some notes and write down your thoughts and really engage with each other. And if you're sitting at a partial table, please move to one where there are more individuals to do that exchange. Before you can truly have an honest conversation on this with others, you have to have an honest conversation with yourself. A conversation that nobody else can hear but you. And it doesn't matter where it lands. It's not about changing anyone's opinion or disposition, but have that honest conversation with yourself. That learning, that revelation can tell you a lot of where we go. Thank you so very, very much, Dr. God. God bless you.
Thank you.
Bless your work. As I said as we began, a great American, and America needs your voice today more than ever. Thank you.
Remember, these conversations are hard. They're not easy. It's not an indictment of you. Thank you so much. It's not an indictment of any individual. They're hard. But we have to have these conversations in love. That's the first thing. Second thing, I think there's a poverty simulation after this. I said I promised I would give a shout out. Go to that right afterwards. But thank you so much for even listening to me. I appreciate it.